kings, queens, princes, and one very embarrassing truth. If you wear enough velvet and act offended with confidence, people will hand you power they would not hand their own family. In this video, we are meeting 33 impostors who borrowed crowns, stole identities, fooled courts, conned elites, and in some cases nearly hijacked history itself. And yes, some of them got exposed in absolutely ridiculous ways. 1. Anthony Gignac proved that if you wear enough designer clothes, arrive in enough rented supercars, and act mildly offended in luxury hotels, people will decide you are important before they decide you are suspicious. Born in Colombia and raised in the United States, he spent decades posing as Prince Khalid bin Al Saud, a Saudi royal with endless money and even more invisible connections. He did not stop at a few party lies either. He built a deluxe fantasy around himself with fake diplomatic plates, bodyguards, luxury homes, expensive watches, and investors willing to hand over serious money just to stand near the sparkle. What finally helped wreck the act was not some genius spy thriller moment. It was ordinary suspicion during a business deal, plus the very awkward fact that this supposed Saudi prince ordered pork. Imagine constructing a 30-year fake monarchy and getting body slammed by bacon. 2. Otto Vida is what happens when history gets drunk, puts on a circus costume, and starts making eye contact with bad ideas. Vida was a German circus performer who later claimed that in 1913 he reached Albania before the real prince, exploited a resemblance, got himself crowned, enjoyed palace life, declared war on Montenegro for no sensible reason, grabbed part of the treasury, and escaped after 5 glorious days. Historians are, very reasonably, skeptical. The whole thing may have been an enormous, self-invented tall tale served with extra mustard. But honestly, that almost makes it better. He sold the story so shamelessly well that people remembered him as the fake king of Albania for the rest of his life, because nothing sticks like a lie told with full, acrobatic confidence. Some men leave a legacy. Otto basically left a rumor and a crown. 3. False Dmitri I was not some harmless fraud sneaking free dinners out of gullible nobles. He actually became Tsar of Russia, which is the kind of promotion most con artists can only dream about while staring at cheap wine and forged documents. During the time of troubles, when Russia was unstable, scared, divided, and ready to believe almost anything wearing royal packaging, he claimed to be Dmitri, the supposedly dead son of Ivan the Terrible. Against all common sense, the claim worked. He entered Moscow with support, took power, and ruled for about a year. Then came the spectacular collapse. He was overthrown and killed in 1606. His body was mutilated, burned, and the ashes were famously fired from a cannon in the direction of Poland, which is less a funeral and more a geopolitical tantrum. Russia did not just reject him. Russia rejected him with special effects. 4. George Psalmanazar understood one very useful thing about early 18th century Europe. If you show up claiming to be an exotic prince and say everything with enough confidence, half the room will turn off its brain and ask for more details. He arrived in Britain pretending to be from Formosa, which is Taiwan, and then invented an entire culture like a man speed-running anthropology with zero shame. He described strange rituals, bizarre customs, fake alphabets, and a language of his own making. He even fed audiences sensational stories about blood drinking and grotesque ceremonies, because apparently plain old lying was not dramatic enough for him. For a while, educated people listened like he was a walking encyclopedia from another world. Then the wheels came off. Real information contradicted his claims, and scholars noticed that his supposedly native language looked suspiciously like a European schoolboy had dressed Latin grammar in a tropical costume. Nothing says mysterious Asian prince-like homework energy. 5. Stephano Turnettic pulled off the modern aristocrat scam with the dazzling confidence of a man who knew that titles, medals, and a straight face can still hypnotize people in the 21st century. He styled himself as a hereditary prince of Montenegro and Macedonia, floated through elite events, collected luxury treatment, and wrapped the whole performance in forged papers, fake institutions, invented orders, and enough ceremony to make people too embarrassed to ask the obvious question. His social theater worked on public officials, celebrities, and assorted status addicts who wanted the fairy tale to be true because it looked expensive. Most famously, he even staged a fake ceremony honoring Pamela Anderson with a royal order that existed only in the same imaginary universe as his throne. The act eventually unraveled when authorities called his documents fake and his titles nonsense. In plain language, the man was running a full-service monarchy out of confidence, printer ink, and other people's weakness for velvet. 6. Marco Tullio Catizone rode one of Portugal's strangest national obsessions, which was the refusal to emotionally accept that King Sebastian had died in Morocco in 1578 and was not coming back with dramatic entrance music. After Sebastian vanished, rumors spread that he had survived and would return, because apparently entire countries can go through a denial phase that lasts decades. Into that mood walked Marco Tullio, an Italian adventurer who inserted himself into the false Sebastian tradition and presented himself as the lost king returned from the impossible. On paper, the claim was absurd. In practice, it landed because Sebastianism had become part politics, part prophecy, and part giant national coping mechanism. Authorities eventually crushed him, and he died for the fraud in 1603. But the truly wild part is that a foreign pretender with the wrong background and the wrong language could still plug himself into Portugal's royal grief and find believers. When a nation wants a miracle badly enough, even a bad actor can get callbacks. 7. William Henry Ellis saw American racial hypocrisy so clearly that he turned it into a brutal little social experiment with excellent tailoring. Born to formerly enslaved parents in Texas, he learned that in the segregated United States, a black man could be humiliated, excluded, and denied comfort, while a so-called foreign prince in the right clothes might be welcomed through the front door with a smile. Ellis had already reinvented himself in business and public life, but accounts of his career show him moving through elite spaces under the aura of high-status foreign identity in ways ordinary black identity did not allow. The result was viciously revealing. The same society that rejected him could suddenly become polite, eager, and deeply hospitable once it thought he came wrapped in royal mystery from abroad. It was not just a con. It was a demonstration that segregation was less about truth than performance, paperwork, and the social panic of white people trying not to offend important foreigners. America looked at a turban and immediately forgot its own rules. 8. Claude de Armois stepped into one of medieval France's most emotionally dangerous openings. The death of Joan of Arc, a national heroine whose fate was so traumatic that many people were strangely ready to believe she might somehow still be alive. Years later, Claude appeared claiming that exact miracle. Even more astonishingly, Joan's own brothers accepted her, at least for a time, and helped escort her around as the returned Maid of Orléans. Towns welcomed her, admirers gave her gifts, and she soaked up fine dinners, attention, status, and the kind of treatment normally reserved for saints or tax collectors with armies. The ridiculous part is not just that strangers believed, it is that family members helped keep the performance afloat, which is either loyalty, wishful thinking, or the medieval version of failing an eyesight test. Apparently, free wine and public excitement can do alarming things to people's judgment. France did not just buy the sequel. France invited it to dinner. 9. Harry Domela was poor, sharp, and gifted with the very useful instinct of realizing when other people have already started your scam for you. In Weimar, Germany, he landed in a luxury hotel, and through a perfect storm of misunderstanding, class obsession, and upper-class imagination, people began treating him like undercover nobility. Most people would panic and correct them. Domela basically decided that if society wanted to hallucinate a prince, it would be rude to interrupt. He drifted from one aristocratic identity to another, enjoying fine treatment, lavish hospitality, and the kind of attention usually reserved for men with too many names and inherited silver spoons. The beauty of the whole act was that he let elites flatter themselves into believing they had spotted disguised greatness. He was eventually exposed not because the rich suddenly developed skepticism, but because he later wrote about how easily he fooled them. That is a ruthless level of honesty. He conned high society and then published the review. 10. False Margaret of Norway proved that medieval Europe could believe some truly heroic nonsense, as long as you wrapped it in dynastic tragedy and said it with conviction. The real Margaret, the Maid of Norway, died in 1290 as a child while traveling to Scotland, where she was expected to become queen. About a decade later, a woman appeared in Bergen claiming she was Margaret and had somehow survived. There was just one tiny issue, by which I mean a gigantic, impossible issue visible to every human eye in the room. She seemed around 40, while the real Margaret would have been about 17. So this was less long-lost queen returns, and more, someone's aunt has launched a constitutional crisis. Yet she still gained supporters among townspeople and clergy. That is the maddening part. Authorities eventually executed her for treason in 1301, but the fact that she got that far says a lot about how powerful royal grief and public fantasy can be. Sometimes history is not a serious institution. Sometimes history is a crowd insisting math is optional. 11. Gregor MacGregor did not merely fake being royalty. He faked an entire country, which is the kind of ambition that makes ordinary liars look like children stealing cookies. A Scottish soldier with towering confidence and nearly non-existent shame, he promoted a fictional Central American territory called Poyais, as if it were a flourishing state full of opportunity, government, roads, and civilized promise. He styled himself its Cazique, basically giving himself a princely title with tropical flavor, then sold land, printed documents, issued bonds, and convinced investors and settlers that this paradise was real. It was not real. Or rather, the land existed, but the state he described was fantasy, wrapped in official-looking paper. People sailed there expecting prosperity and found hardship, wilderness, disease, and death. That is what makes MacGregor such a monster among frauds. He turned fake royalty into a colonial sales brochure and let other people pay for the punchline with their lives. Imagine inventing Narnia and then charging shipping. 12. The Dreadnought hoaxers proved that one of the easiest things to fool is an institution that is extremely proud of itself and would very much like to be admired in full uniform. In 1910, Horace de Vere and friends, including Virginia Woolf, disguised themselves as Abyssinian royalty with robes, turbans, fake beards, dark makeup, and the kind of confidence usually found only in theater people and very dangerous fools. Then they talked their way onto HMS Dreadnought, the pride of the Royal Navy. Instead of being arrested immediately, they were received with full ceremony and given a special tour. Their language was basically nonsense, and accounts famously remember them blurting out "bunga bunga" in admiration like a group of overexcited parrots in costume. Yet the whole performance worked because British authorities saw fancy robes, heard mysterious sounds, and instantly folded into colonial hospitality mode. Sometimes empire is not defeated by artillery. Sometimes empire is defeated by 6 people with fake beards and excellent nerve. 13. False Dmitri II did something that should have collapsed under the weight of basic memory. He claimed to be the same Dmitri who had already died, been mutilated, burned, and had his ashes fired from a cannon, which really feels like a strong signal that the role has been filled and the actor is unavailable. Yet during Russia's time of troubles, this new pretender still gathered followers, because apparently even death was not enough to end a good royal rumor. He built a major following, established a rival court at Tuscino, and became important enough that nobles, officials, and foreign powers treated him as a serious factor. At that point, the real joke is not the liar. The real joke is the political system around him. Russia was so divided, desperate, and opportunistic that a sequel with an already dead protagonist still got funding. History usually dislikes recycled plots. Russia looked at this one and said, "Give us another season." 14. Princess Caraboo was Regency England getting catfished by accent, posture, and pure theatrical audacity. Mary Baker, the daughter of a modest English family, appeared speaking gibberish, wearing strange clothes, and acting like a displaced royal from the distant island of Javasu, which she had very helpfully invented from scratch. Local people did what people always do when they meet confident nonsense wearing mystery like perfume. They completed the fantasy themselves. Soon, she was receiving fine treatment, curiosity, hospitality, and all the fascinated attention that polite society loves to shower on anything it thinks is exotic and expensive. The scam worked because the upper classes desperately wanted a thrilling story to pass around the dinner table with the pudding. It only fell apart when someone recognized her from real life, which is one of the cruelest ways for a fantasy to die. The empire did not expose her. A person from the neighborhood did, which feels spiritually correct. 15. Boris Skosarev looked at Andorra, saw a tiny mountain state with political confusion, and apparently decided it was close enough to available for personal use. In 1934, this Russian-born adventurer swept into the principality with plans, promises, titles, and the smooth confidence of a man who had never once been discouraged by reality. He declared himself King Boris I, floated reform schemes, charmed some local figures, and briefly transformed Andorra into something halfway between a constitutional crisis and a very elaborate practical joke. The astonishing part is that he was humored at all. For a moment, this self-made monarch got to play king in a real place with real consequences. Then reality put its boots on. His reign lasted only days before Spanish authorities arrested him, which makes the entire episode feel less like the fall of a king and more like a badly managed stage production getting shut down by the venue staff. 16. Emperor Norton did not seize a throne through blood, law, or military force. He basically announced himself, and San Francisco, being gloriously weird, decided that sounded better than arguing. After suffering financial ruin, Joshua Norton declared himself Emperor of the United States in 1859, and later added Protector of Mexico, because when you are inventing titles, there is really no point in being modest. What makes his story remarkable is not the claim itself. It is the city's response. Newspapers printed his proclamations, businesses tolerated or honored him, and ordinary people treated him as a beloved civic character for more than 2 decades. He was never really a predatory fraud. He was more like a public agreement that life becomes more entertaining when one harmless man in a uniform is allowed to cosplay federal authority. Honestly, compared with some actual rulers, a local emperor who issued dramatic opinions about public policy sounds weirdly efficient. San Francisco basically adopted a monarch as a neighborhood feature. 17. Alexander Balas proves that, in the ancient world, royal blood was sometimes less a fact than a negotiation with good timing, useful allies, and a face that looked close enough to the right family. He emerged from relatively obscure origins but claimed to be the son of a former Seleucid king, which was a very convenient biography for a man trying to sit on a throne. More importantly, he had the backing of powerful neighbors who found his story useful. That combination turned a doubtful lineage into a political weapon. If enough soldiers, diplomats, and ambitious elites agree that your ancestry seems plausible enough for current needs, your family tree suddenly starts getting treated like sacred truth. Balas was not a tiny footnote either. He actually ruled for years before eventually falling. That is a strong run for a man whose entire royal elevator pitch basically amounted to, "Trust me, my father was king, and no, I will not be taking follow-up questions right now." 18. The story of Prince Shervashidze belongs to that elegant, slippery category of émigré-era aristocratic nonsense where one noble surname, one damaged old world, and one hungry rich audience can create a whole fake destiny. Presenting himself in the United States as exiled Georgian royalty from a fallen order, he moved in the kind of social atmosphere where money loves titles almost as much as titles love money. It was exactly the sort of setting where a tragic prince with continental manners could seem irresistible. According to the story, he married into wealth and lived inside the glamour of displaced nobility until official records spoiled the fantasy with the kind of boring truth that always ruins these things. Suddenly, the elegant prince looked a lot less legendary and a lot more administrative. Even when the colorful details vary in retelling, the core absurdity remains solid. A single aristocratic name, delivered with enough conviction, can make society do backflips for a man it would otherwise ignore in a waiting room. 19. Lambert Simnel was about 10 years old, which is the age when most children are still losing teeth, not launching dynastic rebellions. But adults around him saw an opportunity and turned him into a fake Plantagenet claimant, because English politics at the time had all the calm restraint of a wasp trapped in a goblet. Coached by the priest Richard Simons, Simnel was first shaped into one noble identity and then promoted into the much more explosive role of Edward, heir to Yorkist hopes. This was not some local prank pulled on gullible villagers. He was crowned in Dublin in 1487 in a formal ceremony, while powerful factions used him as a living prop in a serious challenge to Henry VII. Once the rebellion failed, Henry responded with a kind of cold, almost comical pragmatism. He did not execute the child. He assigned him work in the royal kitchens, which is one of the harshest nice try responses in political history. From kingmaker fantasy to dish duty is an absolutely savage career adjustment. 20. Torrentius Maximus exploited one of Rome's strangest recurring obsessions, which was the persistent rumor that Emperor Nero had not really died and would someday return like an imperial bad habit. After Nero's death, enough people remained fascinated, disturbed, or weirdly nostalgic that a convincing impersonator could still find traction. Torrentius had the right look, played the liar like Nero, and understood that imitation is much more effective when you perform the whole brand, and not just the face. He gathered followers, fled east, and managed to persuade the Parthians, Rome's major rival, that backing him might be a wonderfully annoying way to trouble the empire. That is a serious level of fraud. He was not just fooling drunks in a marketplace, he was important enough to become a foreign policy opportunity. Eventually, the scam collapsed, and he was killed. But for a moment, a dead emperor's tribute act nearly turned into regional strategy. Rome was basically one good impression away from a constitutional reboot. 21. Sarah Wilson began as a convicted thief, transported to America, and somehow reinvented herself as Princess Susanna Carolina, supposedly the sister of Queen Charlotte, which is a staggeringly ambitious glow-up by any historical standard. After escaping servitude, she acquired elegant clothes, polished her manner, and started moving through colonial society as if she had grown up ordering footmen around, instead of being sentenced by a court. Wealthy households welcomed her, flattered her, and handed over gifts, attention, and hospitality because people with money are often extremely vulnerable to anyone who promises proximity to greater money. She hinted at influence, offices, and royal favor as if she were casually carrying half the British Empire in her handbag. The whole thing worked because status is often theater, and colonial elites badly wanted front-row seats. Say everything with enough poise and a little offended dignity, and suddenly no one asks for proof. She milked ambition, vanity, and snobbery like a professional dairy operation in silk sleeves. 22. Stephen the Little might be the most effective fraud on this entire list because he did not just enjoy fake status. He actually ruled, and inconveniently for everyone who likes simple morals, he was not terrible at it. Emerging in Montenegro in the 1860s, this obscure man somehow persuaded large numbers of people that he was Peter III of Russia, despite the deeply awkward fact that Peter had definitely died years earlier. But Montenegro was politically fractured, suspicious of outside forces, and highly receptive to a powerful symbolic ruler, so the story landed. Once in charge, Stephen imposed order, strengthened authority, and governed with a level of practical success that must have been very annoying for his critics. That is what makes his story so strange. The man's identity was fake, but the administrative results were real enough to matter. He only fell when assassins finally removed him. It turns out even fake czars can outperform genuine governments, which is not a comforting lesson. 23. False Dmitri III existed because 17th century Russia apparently looked at two fake Dmitris and concluded the problem was not repetition but insufficient volume. By this point, the country was already wrecked by war, factional infighting, foreign intervention, dynastic panic, and enough rumor to power a fleet of lies for generations. Into that chaos stepped yet another pretender claiming to be the long-dead Tsarevich Dmitri. This third version, often identified as a deacon named Sidorka, appeared in 1611 and gained support among Cossacks and others around Pskov. He even became known as the Thief of Pskov, which is not exactly majestic branding, but still not bad for a man impersonating someone who had already died repeatedly in public memory. The truly surreal part is that enough people still took him seriously for him to matter. At some point, the lie stops being impressive and the audience becomes the real mystery. Russia did not just believe in royal ghosts. Russia was practically running auditions for them. 24. Marie-Charles David de Marena went to Southeast Asia and did what only a certain breed of overconfident European adventurer would dare. He invented himself into kingship and then tried to monetize the costume. In the highlands of what is now Vietnam, he proclaimed himself King Marie the First of Sedang, draped himself in symbols, flags, decrees, and the full theatrical wallpaper of sovereignty, then sold the fantasy back to Europe as if he were exporting luxury nonsense. He issued decorations, dangled noble titles, and turned his imaginary monarchy into a revenue stream aimed at people in Paris who apparently had too much money and not enough skepticism. The entire thing feels like colonial vanity mixed with elite shopping addiction. He was not content with being a fake king in the jungle. He wanted to be a fake king with brand extensions. Some people build nations. He built an absurd loyalty program with crowns. 25. The pseudo-Baldwin affair exploded because medieval Europe had a terrible habit of treating the return of dead rulers as a possibility instead of a warning sign. Baldwin IX of Flanders, who had also ruled in Constantinople, disappeared after battle, and years later, a hermit-like figure emerged claiming to be the long-lost ruler restored at last. In a more rational age, this would have ended after a few simple questions and perhaps a light shove out of the gate. Instead, it triggered a major political crisis. Supporters rallied, towns wavered, rulers worried, and the mere chance that he might be genuine became enough to destabilize a large region. That is the sneaky power of royal imposture. You do not need total belief. You just need enough uncertainty to make everyone else sweat through their linen. He was eventually exposed and executed, but not before proving that one scruffy claimant with the right story could make medieval politics lose its mind. Thrones are fragile. Rumors are cardio. 26. Michael Romanoff turned fake nobility into one of the slickest social brands in Hollywood, which is honestly very on-brand for a city that treats reinvention as a competitive sport. Born nowhere near the actual Romanov dynasty and known earlier as Harry Gergeson, he remade himself as Prince Michael Romanoff and then wore that identity so confidently it became part of his charm. By the time he was running his famous Beverly Hills restaurant, the lie was half exposed and half protected by the fact that everyone important preferred the glamorous version anyway. Celebrities flocked there, stars socialized around him, and the whole place became one long dinner party under fake imperial glow. That is what makes Romanoff brilliant. He did not hide from the truth. He simply made the performance more entertaining than the truth, which is often how celebrity culture works on a molecular level. In Hollywood, if the fake prince seats you by Humphrey Bogart, nobody asks for baptism records. 27. Perkin Warbeck was not just another wandering liar claiming he was a missing royal. He became a serious international headache because he inserted himself into one of England's most powerful dynastic mysteries and then managed to make foreign rulers care. Claiming to be Richard of Shrewsbury, one of the vanished princes in the Tower, he offered enemies of Henry VII a wonderfully dramatic opportunity to destabilize England with a living symbol. Margaret of Burgundy supported him, foreign courts entertained him, and real military ventures were launched in his name. That is far beyond the level of a clever dinner party fraud. Warbeck became a geopolitical tool wrapped in princely tragedy and expensive ambition. The frightening part is that his story was plausible enough, or useful enough, that serious people treated him as an option. When kings abroad start funding your fake identity, you are no longer just lying. You are basically an international startup with cavalry. 28. James Jesse Strang did not settle for being a prophet with followers. He escalated straight to king, because some people see a religious movement in crisis and think, yes, this needs more velvet. After the death of Joseph Smith threw leadership into confusion, Strang claimed divine authority, gathered supporters, moved them to Beaver Island in Lake Michigan, and in 1850 staged a coronation complete with robe, crown, scepter, and enough ceremony to make the whole thing look like a kingdom assembled from confidence and spare upholstery. For a while it worked. He exercised real power over the community and made nearby outsiders increasingly uneasy. The funniest detail may be that his crown was not gold but tin, which feels appropriate for a monarchy assembled at the edge of a lake by a man with unlimited nerve. But honestly, history keeps proving that if the speeches are grand enough, nobody checks the metal quality. Leadership, like costume jewelry, shines brightest from a distance. 29. Karl Wilhelm Naundorf looked at one of Europe's most tragic royal stories and decided there was room for him inside it, which is audacious even by impostor standards. This German clockmaker claimed to be Louis XVII, the dead son of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, and for years persuaded some people that he might actually be the lost Dauphin returned. Dozens made similar claims, but Naundorf was one of the most durable because he offered intimate-sounding details and emotional confidence that resonated with royalists who wanted the Bourbon wound to reopen in a useful direction. Some former courtiers accepted him. Others were absolutely horrified by the idea. His French was poor, which is not ideal when claiming to be the missing Prince of France, but apparently conviction can sometimes do the work of grammar. Europe has always had a weakness for sad princes and dramatic survivals. Naundorf simply showed up with both and hoped nobody listened too carefully to the accent. 30. Oreli Antoan Dunos is one of the rare figures on this list who sits in the strange zone between fraud, fantasy, and bizarre political improvisation that somehow made contact with reality. A French lawyer traveled to South America, involved himself in Mapuche resistance politics, and proclaimed the kingdom of Araucania and Patagonia, with himself as king. Naturally, Chilean authorities considered this deranged and eventually arrested and expelled him, because governments can be surprisingly unsupportive when random Europeans appoint themselves regional monarchs. But what keeps his story alive is that he was not just shouting titles into a mirror. Some Mapuche leaders did treat him as a potentially useful ally against Chilean expansion, which gave his fantasy a little real political oxygen. It was still wildly absurd. A provincial French lawyer basically crossed an ocean to become frontier royalty by paperwork, persuasion, and nerve. Colonial history is full of arrogance, but this one arrived carrying its own crown. 31. Pseudo Alexios II used one of the oldest tricks in imperial politics, which is walking in and announcing that the dead emperor is not dead after all, and would now like his throne back, thank you very much. Alexios II had in fact been murdered in 1183, which should have made impersonating him a difficult sell. Instead, this pretender leaned on resemblance, timing, and Byzantine instability, which is really just another word for permanent political whiplash. He gathered supporters and even secured military aid from the Seljuk Sultan, because foreign powers love nothing more than a royal crisis they can ride into battle. That is what makes the story so ridiculous. He did not need universal belief. He just needed one major ruler to decide the lie was useful enough to fund with actual troops. Suddenly, the dead emperor was back in circulation, with an army attached. Byzantium was many things, but calm was never one of them. 32. Allelon Pugachev was not some elegant fraud sneaking around palaces in satin. He was a Don Cossack who claimed to be Peter III, the dead husband of Catherine the Great, and then turned that lie into one of the most terrifying uprisings in Russian history. By presenting himself as the true Tsar returned, he gave peasants, Cossacks, laborers, and other desperate groups a banner powerful enough to unite rage, hope, and revenge under one stolen crown. This was not a drawing room deception. Cities burned, violence spread, and the empire was forced to confront how much misery had built up beneath the surface. That is why Pugachev mattered. His identity was false, but the anger he mobilized was absolutely real. Catherine eventually crushed the revolt and executed him, but not before he exposed the empire's social rot in the loudest possible way. A fake czar nearly brought a real empire to its knees, which is one of history's rudest performance reviews. 33. Anna Anderson became the most famous royal impostor of modern times because she stepped into the one role Europe could never stop emotionally auditioning: the miraculous surviving princess. Claiming to be Anastasia Romanov, daughter of Nicholas II, she convinced a remarkable number of aristocrats, sympathizers, and believers that she had somehow escaped the execution of the imperial family. The Romanov story was already soaked in grief, nostalgia, mystery, and the kind of sorrow that makes people cling to impossible endings. Anderson did not just tell a lie. She moved into a wound and decorated it. Lawsuits dragged on for years, supporters defended her passionately, and critics fought back with equal force. The question became one of those exhausting historical arguments that people inherit like old furniture. Then science arrived and quietly wrecked the drama. DNA evidence showed Anastasia had died with her family, and Anderson was not a Romanov, proving once again that fairy tales hate laboratories. That was 33 people who proved royalty is often just theater with better furniture. Now I want the comments to turn into a full succession war. Who was the most convincing fraud? Who was the biggest idiot? And who did we not include that absolutely deserved a place here? Name names and defend your pick. Hit like, subscribe, and join the channel because history clearly has no shortage of lunatics with crowns.